In the winter of 1887, a single photograph delivered to the Charleston courthouse would haunt investigators for decades to come. It depicted 17 children, ranging in age from 3 to 16, standing barefoot in the snow outside a dilapidated cabin deep in the remote hollows of West Virginia. What made this image so deeply unsettling wasn't merely their skeletal bodies or vacant, hollow eyes. It was the iron shackles visible around their ankles, and the fact that according to all official documentation, the Greylock family of Bone Creek Hollow had reported only 4 children living under their roof. The remaining 13 had been methodically erased from every record, their births never registered, their very existence denied by every adult in that isolated mountain community. Before we go further into the story of the Greylock family and the unspeakable crimes they conceal deep in the Appalachian wilderness, make sure you subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. We bring you the darkest true stories that history tried to bury, and tell us in the comments, what state are you listening from? Let's see just how far these forgotten American horror stories reach. That photograph was only the beginning of a mystery that would expose one of the most systematic cases of child exploitation in American history. Hidden beneath generations of mountain silence and community complicity, Bone Creek Hollow had carved itself into the West Virginia mountains like a wound that never healed. In 1887, this remote valley existed as a world entirely unto itself, cut off from civilization by treacherous mountain passes that became completely impassable during the brutal Appalachian winters. The nearest town, Cedar Ridge, sat 27 miles away through winding deer paths that could swallow a man whole if he didn't know the mountain's secrets. Here in this forgotten corner of America, families had lived by their own rules for generations, bound together by blood, silence, and an unspoken understanding that whatever happened in the hollow remained in the hollow. The Greylock family had staked their claim on the valley's most fertile bottomland back in 1834, when Jeremiah Greylock led his wife and 6 children through the Cumberland Gap during the Great Westward Migration. Unlike other families chasing fortune in gold fields or fertile plains, Jeremiah Greylock harbored altogether different ambitions. He recognized that isolation created opportunity for those prepared to operate beyond society's watchful eye. The hollow provided everything he required. Fresh water from Bone Creek, rich soil for cultivation, dense forests for hunting, and most critically, complete separation from government interference, church oversight, and the curiosity of neighbors. By 1887, 3 generations of Greylocks had transformed their mountain refuge into something far more complex than a simple homestead. Ezekiel Greylock, Jeremiah's grandson, exercised control not only over his immediate family, but over an elaborate network of relatives, hired hands, and what local records euphemistically described as wards. Children whose origins nobody questioned and whose welfare nobody monitored. The hollow had become a self-contained world where Ezekiel's word was law, his justice absolute, and his methods of maintaining order both inventive and terrifying. Ezekiel himself was a man forged by the harshness of the mountain environment. Tall and lean as a hickory sapling, with eyes the color of winter ice, he possessed an intelligence that many underestimated on account of his backward dialect and patched clothing. But concealed behind that carefully cultivated rustic exterior was a calculating mind that had spent decades perfecting a system of control that would have impressed even the most ruthless plantation overseer. His wife Martha Greylock, born Martha Kellerman from a neighboring hollow, had been hardened by 30 years of mountain isolation into something as unyielding and unforgiving as the stone peaks surrounding their home. The Greylock children, at least the 4 officially recognized ones, reflected their parents' severe philosophy. Samuel, the eldest at 19, had inherited his father's cold intelligence and taste for cruelty. Rebecca, 17, carried a quiet viciousness that expressed itself through small, calculated acts of malice. The younger twins, Jacob and Jeremiah, barely 14, had already learned that survival in their family demanded absolute obedience to their father's increasingly disturbing demands, and total silence about what they witnessed in their isolated world. But these 4 represented only the visible surface of a far larger and more disturbing reality. The Greylock family's true power derived from their ability to acquire and control children whose disappearances would never be investigated, whose cries would never carry beyond the mountain walls, and whose labor would never receive a cent of compensation. In an era when child mortality rates ran high, record-keeping was erratic, and communication between remote communities was nearly non-existent, the Greylocks had discovered they could operate their own private kingdom with complete impunity. Their method of acquisition was both simple and diabolical. During harsh winters, desperate families from surrounding hollows would sometimes approach Ezekiel seeking to bind out their children, a common practice where struggling families would send children to work for more established households in exchange for food, shelter, and the promise of an education. However, once these children crossed the threshold into Bone Creek Hollow, they entered a world where legal protections were meaningless, where their original families were told the children had moved on to opportunities in distant towns, and where their new reality was closer to slavery than apprenticeship. Other children arrived through even darker channels. Orphans from failed homesteads, abandoned infants left at remote churches, children whose parents had perished in mining accidents or the diseases that regularly swept through Appalachian communities, all found their way to the Greylock family through a network of corrupt county officials, unscrupulous traveling preachers, and opportunistic neighbors who accepted small payments in exchange for their silence and cooperation. By the winter of 1887, this system had been running successfully for over 2 decades. The official Greylock household consisted of 6 people, but the reality was a carefully orchestrated community of 21 souls, 17 of whom existed in a shadow world of backbreaking labor, inadequate food, and systematic brutality that would have shocked even the most hardened observers of that era. The photograph that would ultimately expose the Greylock family's crimes was never intended to serve as evidence. In December of 1887, a traveling photographer named Henry Peton had been making his rounds through the mountain communities, offering to capture family portraits for the unusually modest price of 50 cents per sitting. For isolated families who might never encounter another photographer in their lifetimes, this represented a precious opportunity to document themselves for posterity. Peton had first heard of the Greylocks during his stay in Cedar Ridge. Local merchants spoke of the family with a mixture of respect and unease, describing Ezekiel as a man who always settled his debts in cash and who seemed to produce an extraordinary volume of crops and preserved goods for trade despite the harsh conditions of his remote hollow. Intrigued by accounts of the family's prosperity and hoping for a substantial commission, Peton made the difficult journey to Bone Creek Hollow on December 15, 1887. What awaited him there challenged every assumption he had formed about backwoods mountain families. The Greylock homestead was not the rough log cabin he had anticipated, but a complex of solidly constructed buildings arranged around a central courtyard. The main house, built from expertly hewn chestnut logs, featured multiple rooms, glass windows, and a stone chimney that spoke of enduring prosperity. Surrounding it stood a large barn, several smaller outbuildings, workshops for various crafts, and what appeared to be dormitory-style structures that seemed oddly institutional for a family residence. But it was the children who first struck Peton as unusual. When he arrived, Ezekiel had proudly introduced his 4 official children, each dressed in clean, well-kept clothing and displaying the kind of respectful manner that spoke of rigid discipline. However, as Peton set up his equipment in the central courtyard, he began noticing other children moving in the shadows between buildings, thin figures who seemed to dissolve into the darkness whenever he looked directly at them, children whose clothing was patched and frayed, whose movements carried a furtive quality that spoke of constant vigilance. When Peton mentioned these other children to Ezekiel, the mountain patriarch's explanation came smooth and reasonable. They were the children of hired hands, orphans the family had taken in out of Christian charity, distant relatives who helped with the seasonal work. All perfectly ordinary for a large homestead in the remote mountains, where extended family networks and informal adoptions were common survival strategies. But as Peton prepared to take the family portrait, something happened that shattered the carefully maintained facade. A commotion erupted from one of the outlying buildings, the sound of running feet, raised voices, and what sounded distinctly like the rattling of chains. Several of the shadow children suddenly burst into the courtyard, and for the first time, Peton got a clear look at them. These were not the healthy, well-fed relatives or hired hands children that Ezekiel had described. These were skeletal figures with hollow eyes, wearing patched clothing that hung from their frames like burial shrouds. And around their ankles, plainly visible in the winter sunlight, were iron shackles connected by short lengths of chain that allowed them to walk but made any possibility of running impossible. The scene that followed seared itself into Peton's memory with photographic clarity. Martha Greylock screamed at the children in a voice carrying decades of practiced cruelty. Samuel and Rebecca moved with swift efficiency to round up the escapees, wielding leather straps with the casual expertise of long practice. Ezekiel's mask of civilized hospitality slipped away entirely, revealing something cold and calculating beneath as he began issuing rapid orders about securing the workers and restoring discipline. In that moment of chaos and exposed truth, Peton's professional instincts overcame his shock. His camera was already set up for the family portrait, and almost without conscious thought, he triggered the shutter. The resulting image captured 17 children standing in the snow outside the main house, their shackles clearly visible, their faces carrying expressions of hopelessness and terror that no passage of time could erase from his memory. The aftermath was swift and threatening. Ezekiel immediately grasped what had happened and demanded the photographic plate. But Peton, sensing that he had documented something of terrible importance, claimed the exposure had failed and that he would need to prepare a fresh plate. This bought him precious time to secretly prepare a second plate bearing the incriminating image while pretending to set up for a retake. When he finally produced a successful family portrait showing only the 4 official Greylock children arranged in conventional poses, Ezekiel appeared satisfied that the evidence of his crimes had been contained. Peton left Bone Creek Hollow that evening carrying 2 photographic plates. One showing the respectable Greylock family as they wished to be remembered, and another containing a truth so horrifying that it would haunt him for the rest of his life. The photographer's hands trembled as he developed the plates in his hotel room in Cedar Ridge 3 days later. The image of those 17 shackled children seemed to stare back at him from the photographic paper, their silent suffering demanding a justice he was not yet certain how to deliver. In an era when photography was still regarded with suspicion in many rural areas, when legal protections for children were minimal, and when the word of respectable white landowners carried enormous weight against the testimony of an outsider, Peton faced a terrible choice. Remain silent and live with his conscience, or risk everything to expose crimes that most people would find easier to disbelieve than confront. Henry Peton's decision to act on what he had witnessed in Bone Creek Hollow was neither immediate nor straightforward. For 3 weeks after his return to Charleston, the photographer found himself paralyzed by the magnitude of what he had uncovered and the potential consequences of exposing it. The photograph sat in his studio safe, its existence known only to him, while he wrestled with questions that offered no easy answers. In 1888 West Virginia, the legal system was poorly equipped to handle crimes of this nature, particularly those involving established landowners in remote areas. Child labor was common and largely unregulated. Informal adoptions and apprenticeships were standard practice. The line between harsh discipline and criminal abuse was often a matter of local custom rather than any legal statute. More troubling still, Peton had begun to understand through careful inquiry that the Greylock family's influence stretched far beyond their isolated hollow. When he finally approached local authorities in Charleston, his reception was mixed and deeply frustrating. County Sheriff James Ruddle listened to Peton's account with skeptical attention but pointed out the practical difficulties of investigating claims against a family living in such remote terrain. More concerning was Ruddle's obvious familiarity with Ezekiel Greylock's name, and his reluctance to discuss the nature of that familiarity. When pressed, the sheriff finally admitted that Greylock had been useful to law enforcement on several occasions and was regarded as a reliable source of information about criminal activity in the mountain regions. This revelation opened disturbing new questions about the true scope of the Greylock operation. Through patient investigation over the months that followed, Peton began uncovering a network of relationships suggesting that the crimes in Bone Creek Hollow were part of a much larger system of corruption and exploitation. Court records from surrounding counties revealed that Ezekiel Greylock had been involved in dozens of child placement arrangements over the preceding 15 years. He regularly appeared before judges to formalize the adoption or apprenticeship of orphan children, always with proper documentation and apparently legitimate arrangements for their care and education. However, when Petan attempted to track down some of these children, he discovered a deeply troubling pattern. They had simply vanished from all official records following their placement with the Greylock family. More troubling still was the discovery that several county officials, including 2 judges and a court clerk, had received substantial loans from Ezekiel Greylock during periods of financial difficulty. These debts created relationships of dependence that effectively guaranteed the family's operations would never face serious legal scrutiny. The Mountain Patriarch had constructed a system of mutually beneficial corruption that shielded his activities while providing valuable services to local authorities who preferred to have difficult social problems handled quietly and efficiently. The reach of complicity extended well beyond government officials. Local churches, which might have been expected to show concern for the welfare of children, had received generous donations from the Greylock family. Several ministers had actually helped facilitate child placements, convinced they were performing acts of Christian charity by finding homes for orphans and troubled youth. The family's reputation for hard work, financial stability, and religious devotion made them ideal candidates in the eyes of the community for handling society's unwanted children. Even more chilling was Petan's discovery that the Greylock system had been functioning for decades. Older residents of surrounding communities, when approached carefully, would sometimes admit to knowing families who had sent children to work for the Greylocks during desperate times. However, these same residents would invariably insist that the arrangements had worked out well, that the children had eventually moved on to good positions in distant towns, and that the Greylock family deserved credit for their charitable assistance to struggling neighbors. The photographer began to understand that he was confronting not merely individual criminals, but an entire social system that had evolved to manage uncomfortable truths by rendering them invisible. The children in his photograph existed in a carefully constructed blind spot where society's protective mechanisms simply did not function. As Petan delved deeper into the historical record, he uncovered evidence suggesting that the current generation of Greylocks had inherited and refined techniques developed by their predecessors. Jeremiah Greylock, the family patriarch who first settled Bone Creek Hollow, had arrived in West Virginia with an unusually large number of children described in early records as bound servants and apprentices. Census records from the 1840s and 1850s showed fluctuating numbers of children in the Greylock household, with some appearing and disappearing from official counts in ways that suggested a system already well in operation. More disturbing still were fragmentary accounts from neighboring families hinting at the fate of children who had proven troublesome or unsuitable for the Greylocks' purposes. Several families reported children who had run off to seek their fortunes after brief stays with the Mountain family, but these disappearances followed suspicious patterns. They typically occurred during harsh weather when travel would be nearly impossible, and the missing children invariably left behind all their possessions, including items of sentimental value that seemed unlikely to be abandoned willingly. The mountain terrain surrounding Bone Creek Hollow offered ample opportunity for the permanent disposal of inconvenient evidence. The area was riddled with deep caves, abandoned mine shafts, and remote gorges where a body might never be recovered. Local hunters and trappers occasionally reported finding unusual bone fragments or scraps of clothing in remote areas, but these discoveries were typically attributed to animal predation or natural accidents rather than investigated as potential evidence of foul play. By autumn of 1888, Petan had assembled a body of evidence painting a horrifying picture of systematic child exploitation stretching back over 50 years. The photograph that had launched his investigation was merely the most recent documentation of crimes that had been hidden in plain sight for generations, protected by a conspiracy of silence, complicity, and deliberate ignorance spanning multiple counties and generations of officials. But evidence alone was not sufficient to ensure justice. The photographer now faced the challenge of finding authorities both capable and genuinely willing to act against a criminal enterprise that had operated with complete impunity for half a century. The breakthrough in Petan's investigation came from an unexpected source. A former resident of Bone Creek Hollow who had managed to escape the Greylock family's control and build a new life in Ohio. In late 1888, word of the photographer's inquiries had spread through the informal networks connecting mountain communities across the region, eventually reaching Sarah Kellerman, a woman living in Cincinnati under the assumed name Sarah Miller. Sarah had been born in 1851 as the youngest daughter of the Kellerman family, neighbors of the Greylocks in the early days of settlement. When her parents died of typhoid fever in 1863, 12-year-old Sarah and her two younger brothers had been placed in Ezekiel Greylock's care through what appeared to be a legitimate guardianship arrangement. What she endured during the following 6 years in Bone Creek Hollow had shaped every single day of her life since her escape in 1869. When Peton finally met with Sarah in December of 1888, he encountered a woman whose testimony would completely transform his understanding of the true scope of the Greylock crimes. Sarah's account revealed that the shackled children in his photograph represented only one component of a far larger and more systematic operation that combined child labor, deliberate malnutrition, psychological torture, and something approaching organized breeding of human beings for exploitation. According to Sarah's testimony, the Greylock family had developed their system over decades of experimentation with different methods of control and exploitation. The iron shackles were reserved for children who had attempted escape or shown signs of open rebellion. Most of the workers in the hollow were controlled through subtler means. Deliberate malnutrition that left them too weak to travel any significant distance. Psychological manipulation that convinced them they were worthless and unwanted by the outside world. And a carefully maintained system of rewards and punishments that kept them competing with one another rather than cooperating against their oppressors. The physical layout of the Greylock compound reflected this sophisticated approach to human control. What Peton had assumed were dormitory buildings were in fact carefully designed prison structures disguised as ordinary farm buildings. The main sleeping quarters for the bound children were windowless structures with heavy doors that could be barred from the outside. Sleeping arrangements deliberately separated siblings and close friends to prevent the formation of bonds that might lead to coordinated resistance. Food distribution served as both a control mechanism and a tool of deliberate physical weakening. The bound children received carefully calculated rations designed to maintain their capacity for work while keeping them too malnourished to attempt escape across the difficult mountain terrain. Sarah described a constant state of hunger so severe that children would fight one another for scraps, creating an environment where cooperation became impossible and survival depended entirely on individual submission to the Greylock's demands. But perhaps the most disturbing element of Sarah's account was her revelation about the family's long-term planning. The Greylocks did not simply exploit children until they became too old to control. They had developed a systematic breeding program designed to produce successive generations of workers who would never know any life beyond the hollow. Teenage girls among the bound children were regularly forced into relationships with older boys or young men, with any resulting children becoming the property of the Greylock family from birth. These second-generation captives, who had never known freedom or any contact with the outside world, were reportedly the most valuable workers in the Greylock system. Having no memory of life beyond the hollow, no knowledge of legal protections or normal social relationships, they were perfectly adapted to their roles as permanent servants. Some had been deliberately kept illiterate and kept ignorant of basic facts about the wider world, making them psychologically incapable of even conceiving of escape, even when physical opportunities presented themselves. Sarah's own escape had been possible only because of her age at the time of her placement with the family. She retained enough memories of normal life to recognize the abnormality of her situation, and enough education to understand that alternatives existed. Her flight from the hollow in 1869 had been carefully planned over many months, requiring her to secretly accumulate food, study the mountain paths, and time her escape to coincide with a severe winter storm that would make pursuit difficult. Even more chilling was Sarah's account of what happened to children who proved unsuitable for the Greylock system. Those who were too sickly to work, too rebellious to control, or simply surplus to the family's labor needs did not simply disappear. They were systematically murdered in ways deliberately designed to serve as lessons to the children who remained. Sarah had personally witnessed several such executions during her time in the hollow, including the drowning of her younger brother Thomas, who had been caught attempting to signal a passing traveler for help. The methods used were deliberately theatrical and educational. Children were forced to watch as their companions were beaten to death, strangled, or thrown into the icy waters of Bone Creek during winter months when the bodies would be trapped beneath the ice until spring floods carried them far downstream. These public executions served multiple purposes. They eliminated troublesome individuals, terrorized the surviving population into total compliance, and delivered practical lessons in the consequences of resistance. Sarah's testimony also revealed the broader economic scope of the Greylock operation. The family's apparent prosperity was built not only on unpaid labor, but on a sophisticated network of criminal activities that included theft, fraud, and what would today be recognized as human trafficking. Children with particular skills or physical attributes were sometimes sold to other criminal enterprises in distant states, generating substantial cash income that helped fund the family's expansion and their ongoing corruption of local officials. The Mountain family had also perfected techniques for acquiring property and resources through systematic fraud. They would identify vulnerable families facing financial difficulties, offer assistance in the form of loans or crop-sharing arrangements, then gradually manipulate these relationships to acquire land, livestock, and eventually children. Over 50 years of such activities had made them one of the wealthiest families in the region, all while maintaining the outward appearance of simple mountain farmers. Most troubling of all was Sarah's revelation about the Greylock family's connections to similar operations in other remote areas. During her captivity, she had encountered children who spoke of other families, other hollows, other places where identical systems of exploitation were operating under different names but following the same patterns. The implication was that the Bone Creek Hollow operation was not unique, but part of a broader network of organized child exploitation stretching across the entire Appalachian region. As winter deepened in 1888, Peton found himself in possession of evidence pointing to one of the most systematic cases of organized child abuse in American history. But he also understood that the very scope and duration of the crimes made them nearly impossible to prosecute through conventional legal channels. Too many officials were compromised, too many years had passed, and too many powerful interests depended on maintaining the silence that had shielded these activities for decades. Armed with Sarah Kellerman's devastating testimony, Peton spent the early months of 1889 attempting to build a case that could withstand the political pressures and legal obstacles protecting the Greylock family. However, his efforts to gather additional witnesses and corroborating evidence soon revealed that Sarah's escape had been neither as clean nor as final as she had believed. In February of 1889, Sarah received a letter at her Cincinnati home that turned her blood to ice. Written in the careful script of someone with limited formal education but considerable cunning, it read simply, "We know where you are, Sarah Kellerman. We know about your husband, Charles Miller, and your daughter, Emma. Mountain justice has a long memory, and family debts are never forgotten. Some secrets should stay buried in the hollow where they belong." The letter was signed with a crude drawing of a Greylock flower, the mountain laurel that gave the family its name. The discovery that the Greylock family had tracked Sarah all the way to her new life in Ohio revealed a level of organization and reach that neither she nor Peton had previously imagined. More disturbing still was the implication that other former captives might have been located and either silenced or brought back to the hollow through threats against the families they had built since their escapes. Peton immediately arranged for Sarah and her family to be moved to a safe location while he worked to understand how the Greylocks had traced her. The answer emerged through his examination of marriage and birth records in Ohio, which revealed that several government clerks had received inquiries about Sarah Kellerman, also known as Sarah Miller, from individuals claiming to be family members seeking reunion. These inquiries had been accompanied by small payments for information and had successfully identified Sarah's current name, address, and family situation. This revelation forced Peton to confront the possibility that his own investigation had somehow been compromised. If the Greylock family possessed the resources and connections to track former captives across state lines, they very likely also had the capability to monitor efforts to expose their activities. The photographer began to suspect that his questions in Charleston and the surrounding areas had been reported back to Bone Creek Hollow, placing both himself and his sources in immediate danger. His fears were confirmed when he returned to his Charleston studio in March to find evidence of a careful but thorough search. Nothing appeared to be missing, but items had been subtly repositioned. Files had been examined, and his safe had been opened despite showing no signs of forced entry. Most chilling of all, a single Greylock flower had been left on his desk, its white petals already browning in the warm indoor air. A message that was both threat and promise. Just when it seemed we'd seen everything, the horror of Bone Creek Hollow grows darker still. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and make sure you're subscribed so you never miss stories like this. Let's find out together what happens next. The escalation of threats coincided with unsettling reports emerging from the mountains themselves. Travelers passing through areas near Bone Creek Hollow reported unusual activity. Large groups of men moving through the forest at night, the sound of construction work echoing from the remote valley, and an increasing number of armed guards observed patrolling the approaches to the Greylock property. Local merchants noted that the family's purchases had shifted toward items suggesting preparation for a siege. Large quantities of preserved food, ammunition, medical supplies, and building materials suited for fortification. More ominously, several individuals who had provided information to Patton's investigation began experiencing their own forms of intimidation. A former county clerk who had admitted to accepting payments from the Greylock family found his barn destroyed by a fire of mysterious origin. A merchant who had discussed the family's unusual purchasing patterns discovered his store had been broken into, with thieves taking only his financial records and correspondence. A minister who had questioned the propriety of child placements with the Mountain family received visits from strangers claiming to conduct religious surveys, who asked pointed questions about his household and daily routines. The pattern of intimidation revealed that the Greylock family's influence reached far beyond what anyone had previously understood. They possessed not only the financial means to corrupt officials and track fugitives across multiple states, but also the manpower to conduct simultaneous operations of surveillance, intimidation, and potential violence across a wide geographic area. Patton's investigation had also attracted unwanted attention from federal authorities, though not in the way he had hoped. Rather than offering assistance in exposing the crimes, federal marshals seemed more interested in understanding why a Charleston photographer was making inquiries that threatened to disrupt established law enforcement relationships in remote regions. When pressed for answers, these officials made it clear that the Greylock family had been supplying valuable intelligence about criminal activities in the mountains for years, and that disrupting this relationship could interfere with ongoing federal investigations into other criminal enterprises. The implication was both clear and terrifying. The Greylock family's systematic abuse of children was being protected because they served as informants for law enforcement agencies that valued their intelligence-gathering capabilities more than the lives of their victims. The federal government was not ignorant of the crimes in Bone Creek Hollow. They were complicit in allowing them to continue. As spring arrived in 1889, Patton found himself trapped in a nightmare of expanding dimensions. His attempts to expose one family's crimes had uncovered a network of corruption, complicity, and organized cruelty reaching into every level of government and law enforcement. The photograph that had launched his investigation was no longer simply evidence of child abuse. It was documentation of systematic institutional failure that had permitted such horrors to flourish under official protection. But the most terrifying development was still to come. In April of 1889, Patton received word that 3 more children had vanished from families in remote mountain communities, all under circumstances suggesting Greylock involvement. The family was not retreating under increased scrutiny. They were expanding their operations, confident that their network of protection would shield them from any consequences. The stakes of Patton's investigation had escalated beyond seeking justice for past victims to preventing future atrocities. Yet his evidence remained legally insufficient, his witnesses were terrified into silence, and his own safety grew increasingly precarious. Time was running out, and the children of Appalachia continued to disappear into the hollow where screams echoed only off mountain stone, and silence was enforced by iron shackles and the constant threat of death. The final confrontation began not with dramatic action, but with a single child's desperate gamble for freedom that would ultimately expose the full scope of the Greylock family's crimes. On the night of May 15, 1889, a boy named Michael Brennan managed to escape from Bone Creek Hollow and made his way through 27 miles of treacherous mountain terrain to reach the town of Cedar Ridge. What made his escape remarkable was not merely the distance covered or the dangers overcome, but the fact that Michael had been born inside the hollow as part of the Greylock family's breeding program and had never once set foot outside the valley in his 14 years of life. Michael's arrival in Cedar Ridge created an immediate sensation and a serious crisis for the carefully maintained conspiracy of silence that had long protected the Greylock operations. Unlike other escaped children who could be dismissed as runaways or troublemakers, Michael possessed detailed knowledge of the hollow's layout, its operations, and the fate of dozens of missing children going back more than a decade. More importantly, he carried physical evidence that could not be disputed or explained away. Detailed maps he had drawn of the compound's buildings, lists of names and ages of current captives, and most damning of all, a collection of small personal items taken from children who had died in the hollow, items that could be matched to missing persons reports across multiple counties. When Michael stumbled into the Cedar Ridge Sheriff's office in the early morning hours, his appearance alone was enough to shatter any pretense of normalcy. His body bore the marks of systematic abuse, badly healed bone fractures, burn marks from disciplinary brandings, and malnutrition so severe he appeared years younger than his actual age. But it was his psychological state that proved most convincing to skeptical authorities. Michael possessed an almost encyclopedic knowledge of suffering, able to describe in precise detail the various methods the Greylock family used to control, punish, and eliminate their captives. Sheriff Ruddled, who had previously been reluctant to investigate any claims against the Greylock family, found himself compelled to act when Michael's testimony was corroborated by multiple pieces of independently verifiable evidence. The boy's descriptions of specific missing children matched official reports with a degree of accuracy that would have been impossible unless he had actually known the victims. His maps of the hollow corresponded exactly with surveying records from decades earlier, and his knowledge of the family's activities included details about their corruption of local officials that no outsider could possibly have possessed. Most compelling of all was Michael's explanation of how he had acquired the information and evidence he carried. As one of the hollow-born children, he had been entrusted with greater freedom than those captured from outside, and had been assigned to assist with record-keeping tasks that required basic literacy. Over years of careful observation and secret note-taking, he had assembled a comprehensive documentation of the Greylock operations, including detailed records of children who had died, been sold, or been killed for disciplinary purposes. The boy's testimony revealed that the photograph Henry Peton had captured in 1887 had shown only a fraction of the truth. At the time of Michael's escape in 1889, the hollow contained 47 children and young adults in various states of captivity, ranging from recently captured 6-year-olds to 20-year-old women who had spent their entire lives in bondage and were now being used to produce the next generation of captives. Michael's escape had been motivated by his discovery that the Greylock family was planning to eliminate their current population of captives and relocate their operations to a new site further west, where federal territories offered even less legal oversight than the established states. The decision to clear out had been prompted by growing scrutiny from Peton's investigation and concerns that too many people were beginning to ask uncomfortable questions about the hollow's activities. The planned massacre was to take place during the summer of 1889, with the deaths disguised as an outbreak of disease that would justify burning the bodies and destroying all evidence. The Greylock family had employed similar tactics before when relocating their operations, but never on a scale this large. Michael had overheard Ezekiel discussing the logistics of killing 47 people efficiently while maintaining plausible deniability, and had understood that escape was the only alternative to witnessing the systematic murder of everyone he had ever known. Armed with Michael's testimony and evidence, Sheriff Ruddled finally assembled a force capable of confronting the Greylock family directly. However, organizing such an operation required extreme secrecy, as the family's network of informants and corrupted officials extended throughout local law enforcement. The final raiding party consisted of federal marshals brought in from outside the region, volunteer civilians with no connections to local government, and a small number of local lawmen whose loyalty could be trusted without reservation. The raid on Bone Creek Hollow took place on June 3, 1889, and what the authorities discovered there exceeded even the scope of Michael Brennan's devastating testimony. The hollow had indeed been transformed into a sophisticated complex designed for the systematic exploitation of human beings, but its scale of operations was far larger than anyone had imagined. In addition to the 47 current captives, investigators uncovered evidence of hundreds of victims stretching back to the family's arrival in the valley 55 years earlier. The physical evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Mass graves contained the remains of children who had died from abuse, malnutrition, or deliberate execution. Detailed records maintained by the family documented the acquisition, exploitation, and disposal of victims with the mechanical precision of a business ledger. Buildings throughout the compound contained implements of torture and restraint that demonstrated a level of sophisticated cruelty that shook even experienced law enforcement officers to their core. But perhaps the most horrifying discovery was that the Greylock family's operations extended far beyond Bone Creek Hollow itself. Documents seized during the raid revealed correspondence with similar criminal enterprises across 7 states, pointing to a coordinated network of child exploitation that had been operating across Appalachia for decades. Letters detailed the sale and transfer of children between different families, the sharing of disciplinary techniques, and coordinated efforts to corrupt local officials and eliminate potential witnesses. The confrontation itself was both anticlimactic and deeply unsettling. When the raiding party arrived at the hollow, they found the Greylock family calmly waiting for them, as though they had been expecting the visit all along. Ezekiel Greylock, now in his 60s but still in possession of the cold intelligence that had built his criminal empire, greeted the lawmen with polite courtesy and immediately began offering explanations for everything they would find. His strategy was sophisticated and came dangerously close to succeeding. Rather than denying the evidence, Ezekiel claimed that his family had been operating under official sanction from federal authorities who needed their remote location and unconventional methods to handle special cases that normal institutions could not manage. He produced forged documents that appeared to authorize his activities as part of classified government programs, and named specific federal officials who he claimed had approved and overseen his operations. The deception might well have succeeded were it not for Michael Brennan's presence with the raiding party. The boy's intimate knowledge of the hollow's operations allowed him to guide investigators directly to evidence that contradicted Ezekiel's carefully prepared lies. More critically, Michael's account of the planned massacre revealed that the Greylock family's apparent cooperation was simply another manipulation, designed to buy time for the destruction of the most damning evidence. As investigators combed through the compound, they discovered that several buildings had been prepared for rapid demolition, with barrels of lamp oil placed strategically to fuel fires that would consume both records and physical evidence. More chilling still was the discovery that many of the current captives had been given what appeared to be poison in their morning meal, suggesting the family had planned to eliminate witnesses even while outwardly cooperating with authorities. The systematic poisoning was halted just in time to save most of the victims. But the incident exposed the true depths of the Greylock family's calculated cruelty. Even when facing certain exposure and punishment, they had prioritized the destruction of evidence over the preservation of human life. The casual efficiency with which they had prepared to murder dozens of children made clear that such acts were routine operations rather than desperate last measures. The trials that followed the Bone Creek Hollow raid became among the most consequential criminal proceedings in West Virginia history. But the pursuit of justice proved nearly as complex and disturbing as the crimes themselves. The scope of corruption exposed during the investigation forced authorities to confront the uncomfortable truth that the Greylock family's activities had been enabled by systematic failures at every level of government and society. Ezekiel Greylock and his immediate family members were ultimately convicted on charges ranging from kidnapping and murder to fraud and criminal conspiracy. But their trials revealed that the network of complicity extended far beyond the hollow itself. 12 county officials, 6 judges, and numerous law enforcement officers were implicated in covering up or directly facilitating the family's crimes. The resulting investigations and prosecutions lasted more than 3 years and effectively dismantled the existing power structure across 4 counties. The fate of the rescued children presented challenges the legal system was woefully ill-equipped to handle. Many of the captives, particularly those born inside the hollow, had no legal identity and no understanding of life beyond their captivity. Efforts to reunite children with their original families were largely unsuccessful, as most had been taken so young that they retained no memory of their previous lives, and their families had long since presumed them dead. More troubling still was the psychological damage inflicted by years of systematic abuse. The rescued children displayed behavioral patterns and trauma responses that contemporary medicine had no framework for treating. Many were unable to adapt to ordinary social environments and required lifelong institutional care. Others simply disappeared back into the mountains, presumably returning to the only existence they had ever known. Michael Brennan, whose courage had exposed the crimes and saved dozens of lives, became a symbol of both heroism and tragedy. While he eventually managed to build a new life in Pennsylvania, working as a teacher and advocate for child welfare reform, he remained haunted by guilt over the victims he had been unable to save, and by the years of suffering he had witnessed in silence before his escape. Henry Petton's photograph, which had set the entire investigation in motion, was entered into evidence during the trials and became one of the most influential pieces of documentation in American legal history. The image of 17 shackled children standing in the snow forced the public to confront the reality that such systematic cruelty could exist in their own communities, concealed behind facades of respectability and shielded by networks of corruption. The broader implications of the Bone Creek Hollow case reached far beyond the punishment of individual criminals. The investigation revealed that similar operations were likely functioning in remote areas across the country, protected by the same combination of isolation, corruption, and willful blindness that had sheltered the Greylock family for decades. Federal legislation was eventually passed requiring stronger oversight of child placement agencies and stricter penalties for officials who failed to investigate abuse reports, though enforcement remained inconsistent in remote rural areas. Perhaps most disturbing was the discovery that several children who had been sold or transferred to other criminal enterprises were never recovered. The Greylock family's records indicated that dozens of victims had been dispatched to locations across the Western Territories, where they disappeared into other networks of exploitation that authorities were never able to trace. The true scope of their crimes may never be fully known, as many victims simply vanished into the vast anonymity of America's frontier regions. The physical site of Bone Creek Hollow was abandoned after the trials, and nature gradually reclaimed the buildings where so much suffering had taken place. Local communities, shaken by the revelation of what had been happening in their midst, chose to forget rather than remember. The hollow fell silent once more, but now it was the silence of shame rather than complicity. Sarah Kellerman, whose testimony had been crucial to the prosecution, never fully recovered from the psychological toll of reliving her captivity through the legal proceedings. She spent her remaining years working with organizations dedicated to finding missing children, driven by guilt over the victims she had left behind when she escaped and by her determination to prevent similar crimes from occurring elsewhere. Her efforts contributed to the establishment of the first systematic missing persons databases in American law enforcement history. The Greylock case forced American society to confront uncomfortable questions about the cost of isolation and the dangers of unquestioned authority. It laid bare how easily systematic cruelty could flourish when communities chose ignorance over investigation, when officials placed convenience above justice, and when society's most vulnerable members existed beyond the reach of any protective institution. The photograph that Henry Petton had risked his life to preserve now hangs in the West Virginia State Archives, serving as a permanent reminder of both human evil and human courage. Those 17 faces, frozen in time on silver halide, continue to bear witness to crimes that many would prefer to forget, ensuring that their suffering was not meaningless and that their stories will not be lost to history. In the end, the Bone Creek Hollow case stands as one of the darkest chapters in American criminal history, but also as proof that even the most carefully constructed systems of oppression can be brought down by individual acts of courage and the persistent pursuit of truth. The children in that photograph waited over 50 years for justice, but it finally came, delivered by a photographer who refused to look away, a boy who risked everything to speak the truth, and a society that eventually found the courage to confront its own failures. This story reminds us that the greatest horrors often hide behind facades of respectability, protected not by supernatural forces, but by very human failures of courage, compassion, and integrity. What do you think of this story? Do you believe such systematic cruelty could remain hidden for so long in isolated communities? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this and want more stories like it, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves dark mysteries. See you in the next video.